Hi, my name is Lyle Murphy, the founder of the Alternative to Med Center, and today we're going to be talking about Paxil, specifically Paxil Withdrawal, Paxil side effects, and some questions people might have regarding help with Paxil tapering. We're going to cover at least 7 topics. The first question is, how do people get put on Paxil? Well, there's the standard depressed, anxious, not able to sleep. But pretty much anytime you go into a psychiatrist's office, you're likely going to come out with a drug, and there may not be a whole lot of logic behind it, honestly. I have seen people put on combinations of drugs that the pharmacodynamics of them make absolutely no sense whatsoever. So since Paxil is an SSRI, probably from the pharmaceutical standpoint, from the allopathic standpoint, why would a person be put on an antidepressant like Paxil? Would be largely because of either sleep issues or because of impulsivity that they have around maybe potentially committing suicide. If it's going to reuptake serotonin as its mechanism of action, as claimed by the pharmaceutical companies, it is believed that serotonin raising will give someone more control over impulsive thinking, help reduce their anxiety, and could potentially help them gather up a bit of sleep. Number 2 question, what does Paxil do to the brain? Again, a lot of this is unknown, it's supposed, so rather than use oftentimes and maybe and as seen by like the pharmaceutical companies like to do, I'll just jump into what we believe. What we believe is that it does, in the synapse specifically, that it reuptakes the serotonin. Now, what does that do? Okay, serotonin, we believe that it's a neurochemical that is an inhibitor, that it's not considered something that's going to raise you up out of depression. It has an inhibitory sort of effect. So if you can imagine the brain being split up into at least 3 different sort of subbrains, where you have the brainstem that deals with fight or flight and impulsivity, sort of reptilian brain sort of functions. A reptile thinks about killing something, or essentially raping something, or devouring something. It's really just sort of impulsive, right? We have a part of our brain that can be like that, that can be very survival-based. And the neurochemicals that are expressed there are excitatory. The higher centers of the brain, which can use serotonin, the more diplomats of a person's brain rather than these more primitive aspects, serotonin is expressed there to add a bit of a flavor of diplomacy to that. So instead of jumping off that cliff because we're impulsively like, oh, I need to just jump, we might stop and think, wow, that's going to really damage my family. That's going to really hurt. Look at that rock right there. Oh my God, I don't want these people to have to clean up my body. Whatever that impulse control is there, we might be able to hit that switch if we have enough serotonin. If we don't, we could potentially act on those impulsive things. When people, they have done interviews with murderers where the murderer was otherwise what you'd consider to be an upstanding person. And in a moment that they barely even remember, they did something and act impulsively. So Paxil would theoretically give you some more control over those impulsive sort of expressions. Okay, number 3, what does Paxil withdrawal look like? Well, we believe that the drug itself is not really making serotonin. It doesn't have the capacity to make serotonin. It spends it. So just like cocaine would spend dopamine, right? And I think by and large the public is aware that cocaine gets you really high for a while, but it doesn't really have the same effect after a certain amount of time. Most drugs are like that. For some people, Paxil seems to work for years and years and years. There is a large part of the population that takes Paxil that it does some things in the beginning, and then the effect starts to wear off. So what's happening there, we think it's that it's reuptaking the serotonin, but then the serotonin is it's preventing the reuptake of the serotonin, right? So if you've got a nerve cell that's releasing serotonin over to this nerve cell, it's supposed to release it, and then it's supposed to pull it back so we can use it again. If it's forced to stay out here and can't come back home, right, it degrades down into its metabolites and then is no longer serotonin. So that would be an exhaustion of the serotonin. Plus, there's this thing called neuroadaptation. If it's constantly getting an inhibitory impulse when the brain is like, hey, we're trying to send signals there that are excitatory to get you to act and do something, and it's not happening, it sort of downregulates itself to the effect of that serotonin, so the serotonin is not as effective. So then when you come off of the drug, especially if you come off of it too fast, there can be a serotonin plunge. A serotonin plunge could look very much like someone has the lack of impulse control to actually stop themselves from doing something, tragic to themselves or to others. Some of the big tragedies that have happened, people coming off of these antidepressants rapidly, probably were just a result of the drug withdrawal itself. And if it were done in a different way, could have attenuated into being tolerable. I have heard stories of, I've been at this for 15 years. I get, we get about 30 calls a day. I don't field all of them, but it adds up. I have logged 20,000 calls in the last 15 years. And I've heard of families, like where a parent kills their child and doesn't even know anything. They don't even remember it until they wake up in prison. And that's kind of a little late to call for help to me, because I can't do much to help them in their criminal case. But it's amazing what can happen when people come off these drugs too quick. It's like when somebody comes off of heroin too quick. What heroin is that it's a synthetic opiate, so it blocks pain. Well, for a period of time, everything is super painful. Even the clothes on that person's skin can be intolerable. A shower can be too much sensation. So, if you can imagine that to the denomination of serotonin, when you come off of the drugs too fast, not only do you have that existing situation where the drug itself is not really working that good because it spent everything, but now you have a complete crash of the system. People can do some really absurd things, and there's how the neurochemistry on a basic level. There's a set point for whether or not that nerve talks to another nerve. So there's sort of a millivoltage level that the nervous system is at, approximately 25 millivolts for many nerves, let's say. Well, in order for there to be nerve conduction, for one nerve to talk to another, it has to drop down lower than that. So there's less resistance to that impulse, so that impulse can conduit across those nerve channels. What serotonin does is it raises the bar, it makes it less likely that depolarization is going to happen. So when an excitatory neurochemical comes in, or excitatory thought comes in, it makes it a little bit harder for it to reach full depolarization. So you can get brain zaps, you can get all sorts of manifestations of anxiety, impulsivity, and since serotonin goes on to form melatonin, coming off these drugs can give you a huge problem sleeping. Question 4. How long does Paxil withdrawal last? Kind of an interesting question in some ways, because the recommendation is not to go cold turkey. If a person were to go cold turkey, the Paxil would start leaving their system in a substantial way. They'd reach the half-life point somewhere in the second to third day. So when you've reached the half-life, that means about half of that medication has cleared your system. That's when you're going to really start peaking out on the withdrawal. And by about a week, you should have the majority of that metabolized. That doesn't necessarily mean how long you're going to be symptomatic. It just means how long are you going to be clearing that from your system, right? So the underlying redoing the neuroadaptation, actually getting those receptors to then upregulate a little bit more to the serotonin, and for you to build up the serotonin stores in your vesicles, and all of the neuroadaptation that's going to occur could take a substantial amount of time. So the trick to doing withdrawal is to withdraw at the rate that all of the rest of that can adjust. For some people, that could be a bit of time. I mean, especially if you're doing it unsupported. Here, most people we can do at 8, maybe 12 weeks, depending on their particular genetics and how long they've been on this drug. Everybody's truly, truly, truly different. So there's not a straight across answer for this sort of thing. But I'm going to answer this question now in the way that I think most listeners and most readers are wanting to hear. So if I cut my Paxil today, let's say I do a 10% cut of my Paxil, how long is that going to last until you start feeling good enough to do your next cut? Around about 2 weeks. You really don't want to push a second taper on top of the one you just had until you've balanced out enough, you're sleeping again, you have control over your impulsive thinking, or whatever your symptomatology that came with that withdrawal. You want to wait for that to cool off a bit before you go to the next withdrawal. I like the withdrawals that cut a certain amount of the drug. So let's say you're going from 20 milligrams of Paxil down to 17.5. You can do that cut, then restabilize at that level before you start another cut. The water titration, sometimes what can happen with that, or when you're doing a compounding, you cut at a steady rate, and you don't really have those periods where you're coming back around and going, oh, I'm ready for the next cut. And you can get into a place where those cuts have stacked, and then you're maybe so symptomatic that going back up the chain might be a bit, where you don't really know how far to go back up, or are truly uncomfortable. So I recommend people do a solid cut, and then they get used to their withdrawal pattern, because that's probably what they're going to expect throughout the duration of the withdrawal. Number 5, what helps with Paxil withdrawal? I'm going to say this, but this is one you really want to run by some practitioner out there to follow. Because I can't make any recommendations to you what you should be doing for your Paxil withdrawal that you should then follow without some sort of guidance or some sort of person that's navigating this. Because Paxil is really working on the serotonin pathway, when a person comes off of that drug, they will be experiencing, more than likely, based upon what we've seen, a serotonin plunge. And we use tryptophan in order to sort of bridge over that. So what we do here is we start tryptophan while they're still on the antidepressant for maybe a week or up to 2 weeks. Then we start that medication withdrawal so that they've built up their serotonin levels enough to be able to endure the withdrawal. You can also use 5-HTP. It's probably not the worst idea to use melatonin. And do know that some people, especially those people that have a mercury burden, may have a paradoxical reaction. We are doing the withdrawal off the antidepressant at the same time that we're doing the infusion of the tryptophan, so that one of them is catching the other, so they're not really having a chance to double down. I would not recommend anybody do long-term antidepressant use with tryptophan at the same time. Some of the other things, I think those are probably the most direct things. Anything that's going to really be hitting the inhibitory pathways, glycine, inositol, magnesium. I would stay away from anything that's like a stimulant. Like SAMe is a mood elevator stimulant. I would stay away from any of that kind of stuff. Anything that's going to be stimulating during this process. I believe I might have mentioned that melatonin can also be helpful for this particular pathway. And number 6 is Paxil a mood elevator. I want to draw a distinction here because when you think antidepressant, you would think it lifts your depression. And people have had that effect, especially if their anxiety was driving them to be so anxious that they couldn't live life, that it could actually have them have a mood elevating moment. But when you're talking about lifting serotonin, you're not really talking about mood elevation. When you're thinking mood elevation, you're thinking about like raising up your dopamine levels. Like Wellbutrin raises up your dopamine levels. This is more considered mood elevation. Paxil is more of an inhibitor to keep a person that might be suicidal from actually acting on suicide, and also having control over their anxiety and other having more diplomacy skills in their brain and being at ease with whatever's going on in their life more so. unfortunately, with a lot of these drugs, like it's not sustainable. Some people, I would imagine, have sustainability with these drugs, but these generally aren't the people that are calling our center. The people that are calling our center are completely wrecked from not having any serotonin left. And these drugs, even if they had some efficacy in the beginning, turned out to be a complete nightmare for our population. Number 7, last question. What are Paxil brain zaps? Well, I don't know that anyone actually knows exactly what those are, but it is a very common phenomenon. As I had mentioned before, there is that baseline. This is the millivolt that it takes in order to have depolarization. So if it's negative 25 millivolts, when you've taken that inhibitor away, right, it's more likely that nerve pathway is going to depolarize. So basically, instead of it being something that might take a 10 millivolt hit, maybe it only takes a 2 millivolt hit. So any little change in a person's mood state, or maybe they ate too much sugar that morning or drank a cup of coffee or something, could totally set them into a wreck. So I believe that's what the brain zaps are, is that they're just in a place where their serotonin deficit is so much that they're having spontaneous firing of neuronal pathways. And if you are having brain zaps, even though the literature says they're not dangerous, I don't know if I would believe that. It's very disconcerting to have something firing off in your head that you didn't expect to have happening. It's usually a good sign that you need to slow down your withdrawal, that your withdrawal is going too fast, or that you need to add some kind of other bridge medication in there to help you get through that area so that you're not having brain zaps. It's okay to go slow on these medications. You don't need to throw yourself in a crisis trying to come off of them, not here or anywhere else. If you're having brain zaps, that is a clear indicator, time to slow down. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this and have a great rest of your day or evening. Thank you.